It was supposed to be her last night. The old neon sign buzzed weakly above the frosted windows of Maggie's diner, barely visible through the thick swirl of snow blanketing the town. The blizzard had rolled in fast winds, howling down empty streets like lost dogs. Snow piling up against the front door like it wanted in. Maggie stood behind the counter, hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, more for warmth than caffeine. The place was quiet. Too quiet. No traffic on the highway. No boots stomping across the welcome mat. No laughter. No regulars. Just silence and snow. She glanced at the register, barely $100 made this week. She'd known for a while the diner wouldn't last through another storm. But still, she showed up. Still brewed the coffee. Still kept the lights on. Habit. Maybe. Or hope. She walked over to the door and flipped the sign to closed. And then, a knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Not from a fist, but from something heavier. Madge's heart jumped. No one should be out in this weather. She hesitated, then pulled open the door. A man stood there, snow clinging to his beard. His coat stiff with frost. His face was red with cold. Eyes tired. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her like someone who hadn't seen kindness in a long time. "Sorry," he rasped, voice barely audible over the wind. "Didn't mean to bother you. Just..." Saw the light. Maggie stared at him. Then, quietly, she stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "You look frozen." She didn't know it then. But that small act opening the door for one cold stranger was about to change everything. The diner had once been full of noise. Coffee brewing. Plates clinking. Stories swapping from table to table like wildfire. Back then, Maggie didn't need to flip the sign. People just came. Truckers. Locals. Even drifters. They knew this was Bill's place. And if it was Bill's, it was safe. Bill had a way with people. He never forgot a name. Never rushed a story. He built the place from scratch after leaving the highway for good. Said he wanted a place where tired souls could rest without spending a fortune. Maggie had just laughed and followed him. That's what she did. She followed him through blizzards, broken fridges, and every slow Tuesday in between. But that was before the heart attack, before the booth in the corner went empty, before the voice that once filled the diner faded into a ghost of memory. Now it was just her, holding on to what was left. She hadn't changed the decor. The cracked leather booths, the sun-bleached photographs, the faded menu board above the counter, all of it was still there. Like if she kept everything exactly the same, maybe the world wouldn't notice how much had changed. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and glanced toward the man now seated near the heater. He hadn't said much after coming in, just nodded when she offered him soup. He ate in silence, hunched over the bowl like it was the first real meal he'd had in days. She knew that look. Hunger. Yes, but also something deeper. Loss? Maybe. Or the weight of too many miles without a place to call home. The heater groaned in the corner, barely keeping up with the cold. Maggie added a log to the stove and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, even though she didn't really want it. She just needed something to hold. It wasn't just the way he ate. It was how his eyes moved slow, searching like he was reading the place. Not just looking at it. He glanced up at the photos on the wall, black and white snapshots of truckers with coffee mugs and windburned smiles. Arms slung around each other, in a time when the diner was full and loud. He stared longer than most would, especially at the photo near the register. Bill, in his favorite flannel shirt, laughing with a wrench in hand, standing next to a radio set. The man didn't ask about the photos, didn't comment. But something about the way his expression softened when he saw Bill's picture-like recognition tinged with grief made Maggie's breath catch. She cleared her throat. "He was my husband," she said quietly, nodding toward the photo. The man looked up, eyes meeting hers for the first time. "I figured," he replied, voice low. "This place still feels like him." Then he went quiet again. Maggie didn't press. She had learned, after Bill passed, that some silences meant more than words ever could. She just poured him another cup of coffee and slid a half-stale muffin across the counter. The man took it with a nod. Fingers rough from work or weather? Maybe both. For a while, they sat in silence, just the soft hum of the heater, the occasional rattle of wind against the window, and the low crackle of the stove. Then, as Maggie turned to check the back room, she heard it. Faint. A whisper of sound that didn't quite belong. The man was humming, barely audible. But the tune was unmistakable. It was Bill's song. A simple country melody he used to hum while cleaning the grill or tuning the radio. Maggie Frodze. Hand on the doorknob. Heart thudding. That tune hadn't played in this diner since the day he died. The humming stopped. Maggie stayed frozen for a moment, then quietly pushed open the door to the storage room. Her hands were trembling, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the song. Maybe it was the way he said Bill's name without needing to ask. Maybe it was the cold creeping in through cracks no one could seal anymore. She flicked on the light. The bulb buzzed overhead like a tired bee. Stacked against the walls were half-empty boxes, dented cans, and old cleaning supplies. A single bag of flour, a few cans of beans, 1 gallon of milk. Already close to turning. That was it. She pulled out the ledger, the handwritten notebook she used to track every cent. Rent, gas, supplies, repairs. The numbers hadn't lied for months. The diner was sinking, and she had run out of buckets. Last week's income had barely covered utilities. The refrigerator hummed louder than the customers these days, and she was tired, not just body tired. Boot-soul tired. The kind that made you stare at your hands too long. The kind that made every small task feel like lifting bricks. She remembered telling herself, "1 more week. Then, maybe after Christmas. Then, just until the snow passes." But deep down, Maggie had known for a while now this storm wouldn't pass. The roads had changed. The regulars had moved. The new bypass took the traffic elsewhere. And she couldn't keep fighting ghosts. She closed the ledger and leaned against the wall, letting out a long, tired breath. For the first time in weeks, she let herself admit it. Tomorrow, she'd hang the closed sign not for the night, but for good. She stared at the cracked linoleum floor for a long time. Then, wiping her hands on her apron, she forced herself upright. The man out front still needed warmth. One last night. One last meal. She wasn't going to shut the door on someone. Not tonight. Maggie didn't speak when she returned to the front. She just moved slow, deliberate, like the decision had already been made in some quiet corner of her heart. She turned the burner back on and lit the stove, pulled out a saucepan and the last can of tomato soup, opened a stale loaf of bread, sliced what was left, and threw it on the griddle with a bit of butter. She didn't care that it was her own dinner. She didn't care that there was barely enough left for tomorrow. Tonight was about something else. The man looked up but didn't say a word. He watched her with quiet eyes as she stirred the soup, flipped the bread, moved with the grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times and maybe wouldn't get to do it again. When the bowl was hot, and the sandwich golden brown. She placed them both in front of him without a word. Just a small nod. Then she filled a second mug with coffee and set it beside the food. He stared at it for a moment. "You don't have to," he began. "I know." Maggie interrupted gently. He held her gaze. Then he picked up the spoon. They didn't speak for a long while. The diner filled with small sounds, the clink of metal on ceramic, the hiss of snow against glass, the soft shuffle of Maggie wiping down an already clean counter. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, for the first time in days, there was warmth. After he finished eating, the man leaned back in the booth, sighing deeply. "Best meal I've had in a while," he said. Maggie just smiled. Not a big smile, just the kind that tugged at the edge of her mouth. Tired and honest. "I've got a cot in the back," she said. "It's not fancy, but it's dry." He looked at her like he didn't quite know how to thank her. But he didn't have to, because some kinds of kindness don't need receipts. Later that night, long after the dishes had been cleared and the lights dimmed, Maggie sat alone in the booth by the window, the one Bill used to claim as his throne. She didn't know why she couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the storm still roaring outside. Maybe it was the presence of someone breathing quietly in the cot just behind the kitchen wall. Or maybe it was something else. A feeling. A pull. The radio above the counter crackled faintly. Just static. She hadn't touched that thing in months. Years. Maybe. After Bill died. It had felt wrong. Like listening to ghosts. Then, a voice. Soft. Gravelly. Low. "I used to come through here. Years ago." Maggie turned. The man stood at the edge of the hallway, blanket around his shoulders, holding a chipped mug in both hands. He wasn't looking at her. Just out the window, where snow blanketed the world in white silence. "Didn't look like this then," he continued. "Used to be crowded. Full of stories. Laughter. One guy used to stand right there by the counter and tell the worst jokes I ever heard." Maggie felt her chest tighten. "That would have been Bill," she said softly. The man finally looked at her. His eyes weren't just tired now, they were full of memory. "I figured," he murmured. He stepped closer, nodding toward the old CB radio on the shelf. "You ever go by Breaker 71? Maggie's breath caught. "Yeah." That was his handle. A faint smile crossed the man's lips. "Mine was Red Dog." Silence. Real. Heavy silence. Maggie stared at him. She remembered that name not just from Bill's stories, but from nights when the radio stayed on and voices filled the room like old friends passing through. "You're Red Dog," she whispered. He nodded once. "I owed him," he said. "A long time ago. He stayed on the line with me through a bad patch in Wyoming. I thought I wasn't going to make it out. But his voice, it kept me driving." He looked around the diner, like he was seeing it not for what it was, but for what it used to be. "I saw the light on. Figured I'd stop. Didn't expect..." He paused. Didn't expect it to still feel like him. Morning came slow. Gray light filtered through the snow-frosted windows, casting a quiet glow across the linoleum floor. Maggie stirred on the cot in the back room, half covered in a patchwork quilt. Joints aching. Eyes heavy from a night of almost sleep. The storm had stopped. Outside, silence blanketed the town in thick white stillness. She sat up, rubbing her hands together for warmth, and shuffled toward the front of the diner. Her boots creaked against the old floorboards. She didn't expect anything to be different. She didn't expect all of them. At first, she thought it was just a mirage. One truck. Then two. But as she stepped closer to the window, her breath caught. The parking lot was full. Not a few trucks. Not a small convoy. Full. Rows of semis lined the side street. Engines humming low in the morning frost. Chrome grills glinting like silver teeth in the pale sun. Maggie pressed her palm to the window, as if to make sure it was real. Then she saw him. Red Dog. Standing outside near the pump. Talking to another driver. Then another. He motioned toward the diner. And they nodded. One by one. Truck doors swung open. Boots hit pavement. And laughter real. Rolling laughter cut through the morning cold. Maggie stumbled back a step. Stunned. The bell over the door jingled. And just like that, the quiet was gone. A woman in a flannel coat stepped in first, stamping snow off her boots. "Morning," she said with a grin. "This still Bill's place?" Maggie blinked. "It was, well," the woman said, tugging off her gloves. "He saved my cousin's life back in '06. Talked him through a tire blowout in the mountains. Always said if I was ever near this place, I had to stop in." Behind her, more drivers stepped inside. Men, women, younger, older. They nodded at Maggie. Some offering smiles. Some carrying small boxes. One man handed her a bag of flour. Another carried a case of coffee beans. A third simply tipped his hat and whispered, "Breaker 71. Maggie stood still, overwhelmed, as the diner filled with life she hadn't felt in years. And outside, the trucks kept coming. The diner was alive. Boots stomped warmth back into frozen toes. Coats were hung over chairs. Steam curled up from fresh coffee pots. Maggie moved behind the counter like in a dream, refilling mugs, slicing bread, handing out everything she had left without keeping count. And still, they kept coming. Some brought groceries. Others helped sweep snow from the steps or restock the nearly empty pantry. There was no plan, no leader, just movement, purpose, and quiet reverence for a man they had never forgotten. "I broke down in Kansas," one driver said. Voice rough, middle of nowhere. No cell signal. No radio. "I was stuck there for hours. Then I heard his voice over CB. Breaker 71. He stayed with me until help arrived." Another nodded. "He guided me through a whiteout on I-80. Didn't even know me. But he kept me company the whole way." A young woman spoke up from the corner booth. "He helped my mom once. She always said his voice sounded like home." Maggie stood frozen for a moment, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the coffee pot. Bill had told her some of these stories. Others, he never mentioned. Maybe he thought they didn't matter. Maybe he didn't want the praise. That was just how he was. But they remembered. Not just his voice. His presence. What he stood for. And now, somehow, they had come back not because someone asked them to. Not because of an ad or a call for help. But because they saw the light and followed it. Red Dog sat at the counter again, sipping slowly from a chipped mug. He didn't just keep people company. He said, he kept them going. Out there. Sometimes, all you've got is a voice in the dark. Bill made that voice matter. Maggie pressed her palm against the counter, eyes glistening. For years, she thought the world had moved on, forgotten him. Forgotten them both. But here they were. Truckers. Drifters. Voices from the road returning like migratory birds to the place that once kept them warm. At some point, Maggie stopped wiping the counter. She stood still, hands resting on the edge of the worn formica, eyes fixed on the space in front of her, but seeing something much farther away. A voice deep, familiar echoed in her memory. "Coffee's hot, and the grill's warm. Come in or keep driving. But don't block the lot." Bill used to say that every morning, loud, laughing, as if even the silence owed him a smile. She hadn't heard it in years. But today, it felt close. Red Dog's words still lingered in the air. So did the smell of fresh brewed coffee, and the low hum of voices swapping road tales. The diner sounded and felt like it used to. But Maggie, she hadn't felt whole in a long time. She turned slowly to face the room. The drivers looked up some mid-conversation. Others halfway through a bite and fell silent. "I kept it open," she said, her voice steady but low. Even after he passed, no one moved. I told myself it was because of the town, or the regulars, or some sense of duty. But that wasn't the truth. She looked down, fingers clutching the edge of the counter like it might slip away. "I kept it open because I didn't know how to say goodbye." A hush fell over the room, heavier than the snow outside. I used to wake up and hear him. In the sizzle of the griddle, the pop of the coffee pot. I thought if I just kept showing up, if I just kept the door unlocked, maybe somehow, he'd still be here. Her voice cracked, but over time, the silence got louder, and I thought maybe everyone forgot him, that all those voices out there had moved on. She paused, looking up. "But you didn't." The tears came then, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet streams carving their way down her cheeks. No one rushed to comfort her. No one interrupted. They just listened. Because that's what road people do. They know what it means to carry weight in silence. It was Red Dog who stood first. He placed his mug gently on the counter and pulled something from the inside of his coat, a thick envelope, creased at the edges, sealed with tape. He slid it toward Maggie. "We passed the hat," he said. "Among the drivers, some dispatchers, couple of old radio guys. Nobody forgot him." Maggie looked down at the envelope, her fingers hovering above it like it might burn. "It's not charity," Red Dog added, his voice firm but kind. "It's thanks. For every mile he kept us company. For every night his voice meant we weren't alone." Her hand trembled as she picked it up. It was heavier than she expected, not just in weight, but in meaning. She didn't open it yet. She didn't have to. She already knew. It was enough. Enough to catch up on the bills. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to let her breathe. But that wasn't the end. Another driver stepped forward, older, with silver hair under a trucker cap, and a CB radio mic dangling from his fingers. "This belongs to you," he said. He set the mic on the counter gently. It was worn, scratched, the cord frayed near the base. But Maggie recognized it instantly. She'd wrapped that same cord 100 times. Cleaned it. Heard Bill's voice crackle through it more nights than she could count. "I was out in Colorado back in '92, the man said. "Mine died mid-blizzard. Bill, your husband, handed me this one at a truck stop without saying a word. Just smiled and said, 'You'll need it more than me tonight.'" His voice caught. He was right. Maggie's hand hovered over the mic like it was a sacred object. She didn't trust herself to speak. Red Dog leaned closer, smiling now. Words out. "You know, every driver from here to the Rockies is talking. You're not getting rid of us that easy." Laughter rippled across the diner, again warmer, louder this time. And just like that, something shifted. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, the road hadn't forgotten them after all. 1 year later, Maggie stood behind the same counter, apron tied, hair pulled back, eyes clearer than they'd been in years. The sign outside had been repainted, Maggie's mile marker, hot coffee, warmer hearts. The bell over the door jingled again. Another driver stepped inside, stomping off the dust of a long haul, his hands still on the straps of his backpack. "First time here?" Maggie asked, pouring a fresh cup. He nodded. "Heard this place is kind of legendary." Maggie smiled. "First coffee's on the house. And so's a story if you're staying long enough to hear one." The diner had changed, but not in the ways that mattered. The tables were still mismatched. The floors still creaked. The old CB radio still sat on the shelf above the pie case, cleaned up, rewired, glowing faintly blue. Drivers still stopped here, not just for food, but for the feeling, the kind you couldn't list on a menu. Out front, the parking lot overflowed with rigs from all corners of the country. Some stayed the night, some just long enough to share a joke and a memory. And Maggie, she kept the door open. She brewed the coffee. She listened. She laughed. Sometimes, when the nights were long and the wind picked up outside, she'd sit in Bill's old booth and turn the radio on. Sometimes it was static. Sometimes a familiar voice. But always, someone on the line. Because on the road and in life we are never as alone as we think. Maybe you've never driven a truck. Maybe you've never sat alone in a diner at midnight, wondering if the world has passed you by. But if you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever held on to something or someone just because you weren't ready to let go, then maybe, in some small way, you understand Maggie. If this story touched you, even just a little, we'd love to know. Tell us in the comments who's the one voice in your life that kept you going when everything else went quiet, and if you believe, like we do, that kindness still matters. Hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that remind us we're not alone. Because somewhere out there, someone's still listening.